Hi, I'm Deanna Springer.
And I'm Dana Casey with a fun Stitch It Sisters sewing project and classic time-saving tips by Nancy Zieman.
First, let's take a look at the project we're making today. We'll be sewing our new tunic pattern, McCall's 8022. The pattern features two views, a cowl neck version and a hooded version. Both views are sewn with flattering princess seams, and there's a hidden pocket between the front seams. We'll be using our new Ponte knit fabric with spandex, Pellon's Easy Knit fusible interfacing, Clover's 5-in-1 sliding gauge, the supersize version, Clover's clip and glide bodkin, a little shock cording, a cord stop, and chrome jersey ballpoint needles from Schmetz.
Last time we shared our techniques for pattern fitting. Today we look forward to sewing it.
To make our tunic pattern, we'll start by pre-washing our fabric. We have our Ponte fabric with a little bit of Lycra in it for some give and recovery. So we'll wash that, and I wash it in cold water in the washing machine, and you could dry it in the dryer, but I like to hang it to dry. That's how I'll treat my finished garment, just to keep the fabric looking like it's brand new.
Okay.
And then we'll also use some fusible tricot interfacing, Pellon's Easy Knit. We'll cut it into strips, but we're also going to back the back side of our pattern pieces. So each pattern piece has a layer of Pellon Easy Knit fused to the back. And if it's a pattern we're going to use over and over, or handle, or do some pivot and slide fitting techniques, it's nice to have that there.
Very good, because that tears very easily.
It can tear very easily, especially when you're pinning. And if you want to use it over and over, if it's your favorite pattern, it's a great technique. A classic time-saving tip from Nancy Zieman. Another classic time-saving tip from Nancy Zieman is to mark the grain line on the pattern. The pattern pieces are already marked with a grain line. We'll turn this sideways, and you can see the grain line originally was marked just in the center of the pattern. So we want to extend that. Another great tip I learned from Nancy. Extend that grain line all the way to the end of the pattern piece.
Can you explain to me what a grain line is?
Sure. Grain line helps you keep the fabric on grain or straight, or to prevent it from going on the bias. So when you're laying out your fabric yardage, which is the next step, you'll lay out your fabric and you'll lay your pattern pieces on your fabric according to the pattern guide sheet. And then you'll want to measure from the straight edge of the fabric to your grain line, and make sure that the measurement at the top of the pattern piece measures the same as the middle and the bottom.
Okay.
So it prevents your pattern pieces from going off grain, which will cause them to stretch and grow in undesirable ways. So you want to make sure that you lay out your pattern on grain.
Okay.
After we have our pattern pieces cut out, we're going to do a few stay stitching steps. So for stay stitching, I mean stitching the flat piece. This happens to be the center back panel. Stitching that back pattern piece along the neckline and at each side seam from the waist up.
Okay.
So this is actually a center back side seams. What this does is create stability. It'll keep this from stretching out of shape when you sew this to the side back.
Okay.
And it also is a nice stitching guide. It does hold its shape in the neckline, and then we're going to, when we stitch the collar into place, we'll make sure we stitch just on the inside of that stay stitching, and we'll have a stitching line to follow.
Oh,
stitch by the line. We'll also use some 3/4 inch strips of Pellon Easy Knit, and we apply it to the back shoulder. So on the back shoulders, you'll cut and press at the ironing board some Pellon Easy Knit 3/4 inch strips to the back of the shoulders, just on the back piece. The next step in stitching the tunic would be to attach the back panels.
Okay.
So at the sewing machine, you'll simply stitch from the top armhole all the way down to the hem and attach both side back pieces to the center back. And we'll set that aside too. Next is the sleeve. To prepare the sleeve, I've added that 3/4 inch Palin Easy Knit strip to the wrist area, so it holds some shape and gives it body when you're wearing the garment in the future too.
Okay.
I've also done stitching here, but it's not stay stitching. It acts like a stay stitching, but it's doing two things. You can see when we're stitching it at the sewing machine that I'm holding my finger behind the presser foot and I'm preventing the fabric from easily leaving behind the back of the presser foot. Do that stay stitching and start that sleeve to have a little bit of memory when you sew it in. So it's going to naturally want to set into the arm's eye by having that. I don't want to call it gathering. In the 80s, we did a lot of gathering.
We did.
This is easing that fabric, starting the process of curving it around to be set into the arm's eye.
Okay.
The next step will be to insert our pocket, that hidden pocket between the front side pieces. So it's right in the center panel. This is the front center piece, and we've done our stay stitching. Very important, don't skip it. It makes your sewing assembly job easier as we go on in the process. So you'll just match, I'll pull this up here. You'll just match the pocket notches to the pocket. And I've clipped them so I know where to place this. So I'll place that pocket right here, and we'll do a little pinning. And we'll pin that side, that center pocket to the center front. The pattern tells you to cut 2 pockets. This is just one. So we're pinning it one layer of the pocket to the center front. And then we're going to stitch. At the sewing machine, we'll stitch the pocket. And this sample shows that that one pocket layer has already been stitched into place. And I've stopped stitching at the dots. The pattern piece shows you to stitch between the dots, and that allows you to later stitch it to the pocket lining.
Oh, okay.
So this is just half of the pocket, like we talked about, on the center front, and the next step is kind of unusual. We're going to turn this right side out, and we'll do a little pressing. These extra steps are easy to do, all straight stitching, but they add a designer detail. So once this is pressed, you'll have a center front piece that has a pocket attached to it. We'll set that on your side because that will come back later. Once we have the pocket stitched to the center front piece, we need to stitch it to the center side pieces.
Okay.
These are the 2 side front pieces. So I have them laying side seam over side seam, and both of them are right side up.
Okay.
And then I place, according to the pattern notches, the pocket to the seam. So actually these are not attached, but once you stitch that pocket to the center side seams, they become attached. And they're kind of unusual. You don't usually see this when you're assembling a garment.
No.
But it's very interesting why. And we'll bring your center front back into place. And this is why it's a great project to show, because it's such a unique design that goes together quickly. So this is the inside of the pocket, right side. Wrong side, I'll have you hold that, please. This is the wrong side of the center front, right side of the pocket. And we'll just overlay our side panels. This is when it becomes familiar, the classic princess seam. So instead of just sewing the seams, we're inserting a pocket easily with all straight stitching.
Okay.
The next step would be to sew front, center, and side seams. It's a front side seam, and there are 2 of them in the front. But we'll do a little pinning and aligning that pocket. And this is where the uniqueness comes in. Once this is all pinned, and match your notches, and match the top of your pocket, and you'll do the same thing at the bottom. So now, the next step you would think would be to sew that entire front side seam from top to bottom.
Right.
But we can't do that or the pocket will become sewn shut.
Well, you don't want that.
So what we'll do is we'll start at one edge and we'll stitch from the arm's eye down to the top of the pocket. We'll drop our needle and we'll stitch across the top of the pocket.
Oh, okay.
We'll drop our needle and pivot and stitch the remaining side seam.
So come back up.
Right. We'll repeat the process to stitch the bottom. Again, you'll stitch from the bottom to the bottom of the pocket, attaching those 2 pocket layers, and then back down towards the hem. And you can see it in our next sample where it's already sewn. So once the side front is attached to the center front, our tunic is coming together, it's getting larger. You can see the stitching is complete. And now the front of our tunic is complete. The next step would be to sew our shoulder seams. And you remember from earlier, on the back pattern piece, we've fused easy knit strips, 3/4 inch easy knit strips to the top shoulder seam. On the front, another classic time-saving tip from Nancy, stitch that seam with elastic. So this is our clear elastic.
Oh, okay.
And we just catch it right in the seam. And that allows bounce and recovery, even when you're putting the garment on and off.
Sure.
It keeps stitches from popping. And you can see that it's stitched with a wobble stitch. And we've stitched with wobble stitches before.
We have.
You probably remember the setting. It's a zigzag stitch that is modified so that it's almost a straight stitch. And our stitch width is 0.5.
Okay.
And our stitch length is 2.5.
All right.
And that's how the stitch that we use to assemble the entire garment with our chrome Schmetz needles. We'll come back to this, so I'll drop it down the board. But we need to make a cowl neck. And this is another interesting detail that's all done with straight sewing in rectangles.
Okay.
So even though the cowl is compact and is just right, it's cut from a larger rectangle, one rectangle. And it features that shock elastic cord in the cord stop. We start with a rectangle. It's just an easy rectangle, but on the pattern piece, there are markings for stitching lines and notches and things.
Okay.
But the first step is to sew the side seam. You wouldn't think that cowl would be this pattern shape, but it's almost like the size of a fat quarter when you start out. So we put it right sides together and we stitch. We stitch that side seam. It's the side neck seam.
Okay.
And in the next sample, it's already stitched. And you'll notice it's not a 5/8 inch stitching
No,
seam.
that's a big seam allowance there.
It's a large seam allowance, and you don't want to forget to do that because that later creates the drawstring for the shock cord.
Okay.
And you also need to leave an opening for that shock cord to come through. So we've stitched at the sewing machine with a 6-in-1 stick and stitch seam guide. And we've stitched that all the way down at 1 inch, and we've made sure to leave that opening. On our next sample, we've pressed it open. That 1 inch seam allowance is pressed open, and here is the opening for that shock cord.
Okay.
To make this into a collar, we need to fold it right sides together. And I stack that seam, and that seam will become our stitching line. And you don't want to pin it through all those layers like I did. So match, do a little fussy turning, and just turn that big rectangle right side out. Not so big anymore, it's starting to look like a cowl neck collar. Stack that seam, and there's that opening.
Okay.
And you want to be sure not to stitch that opening shut. So we'll do a couple of rows of stitching, actually 3 rows of stitching. And I think our next sample shows that. And I use Sewer's Fix-It tape. And I put a piece of tape, kind of like a no-sew zone. Don't sew that opening shut because we need to insert the elastic shock cord.
Okay.
We also can't sew the top of the collar because the elastic cording will come up and down and out.
And loop around.
It'll
Okay.
loop around. So we've stitched, and you can see it right stitched in that well of that seam. And I've done it with white thread so you can see it easier. And that sews our collar together, but it's still open. It's still a big open rectangle. Now is when I insert the shock cord. And we'll need a cord lock in a little bit, so we'll put that there. And we'll be using Clover's Clip and Glide bodkin to insert the shock cord. So you just release the clamp, and the gripper teeth grab onto that shock cord. Once you clamp down, that's secure. And it's easy. You can fit the clip and glide bodkin through a channel that's 3/4 of an inch or larger.
Okay.
So you can do drawstrings and elastic and trims and things. Here we're going to insert it into that opening. So we can remove our no sew zone tape, our sewer's fix-it tape. Trust me, even making these samples, I start thinking about my grocery list, my shopping I have to do,
Zip
and
right over
I
it.
sewed it right shut. So you just get out your reverse stitcher, your seam ripper,
Right.
and open that back up. To insert the elastic cording, it's super easy because you can just reach in and you can see it's right there because we haven't sewn any seams. And I'm doing this upside down and backwards, but we're inserting it through that opening that we left, and then you need to insert it through that top opening. So I'm manipulating it between those seam allowances to pull it through. Sometimes you can just open it and peek. There it is. I'm putting it through that seam allowance. That's the toughest part right there. And then I'm advancing it. There's a nice thumb grip that I'm pulling it through that little tiny casing, the world's smallest casing right there. And then I'll reach in between the layers and I'll pull that down. And the key is you don't want to pull this all the way through. So you could attach the cord stopper now, or just use caution and come back out that opening. So the same opening we went through, the only opening, we pull that through. So the cord is in there, but it's not exactly in a cord casing.
Okay.
And you could, at this point, attach your cord stop if you want the raw ends there. But I like to sew the shot cord together, just do a little zigzagging and attach that. And then I fussy turn the shot cord in the casing. So what you're left with is a clean loop. And that's what I attach the cord lock to. And it because it's attached later at this point, you can remove it for laundering.
Oh, sure.
We'll set that back over here. We need to go back to the sewing machine and make some casings for this shot cord. So with your supersize 5-in-1 sliding gauge, the next measurement is going to be 5/8. And we know the width of the 5-in-1 sliding gauge is 5/8 of an inch. And with a Clover's chocolate liner, we'll trace that 5/8 on each side of that seam and we'll stitch. So we just do that wobble straight stitching on each side and you have a cowl collar.
Oh, neat.
Complete and ready to insert. So you may guess the next step is to insert that collar into the bodice. So with right sides together, you'll align and you'll do a little pinning and you'll get that cowl collar set into place. Once it's sewn, it's just like any other round collar. You just sew that and insert that into the neck opening.
Oh, sure.
So we'll visualize that collar is already in place and we'll take a look at where we're at. Right now it's flat. Another classic time-saving tip from Nancy, flat construction. Most patterns tell you at this point, place the back and the front right sides together and sew that side seam. And then insert your sleeve into that round opening. Nancy taught us to insert those sleeves. Instead, we'll insert the sleeve flat construction. We'll align our seams, our notches, and our underarms, and we'll go to the sewing machine and we'll sew our sleeve in place. Once the sleeve is sewn in place, then we sew the side seam. But at the same time we sew the side seam, we're doing flat construction. So we'll actually sew from the bottom hem all the way up, and we'll sew the sleeve at the same time.
That's definitely an easier way to do than sewing it into the hole.
Flat method construction, and it's easier to work with. Well, the next step will be hemming. We're almost finished with our tunic.
Wow.
So we'll press up and stitch that, and we'll top stitch that hem with a wobble stitch. And we'll do the same thing for the bottom hem. And I like to use Clover's hot ruler to press that up in place and then top stitch. And that's complete. Your tunic is complete.
Yay. Ready to wear.
Right. We hope you've enjoyed the Stitch It Sisters project. You'll find this pattern along with a limited number of bundle boxes at stitchitsisters.com.
Be sure to tune in again for another Stitch It Sisters sewing adventure.
In the meantime, connect with Stitch It Sisters and friends on our social sites. Stitch It Sisters is made possible by Clover, Pellon, Schmetz Needles, and ShopNZP.com.